Hi. I went with Black Lives Matter, which kind of was an ad hoc, impromptu coming together of organizations and people in response to what was going on in Ferguson. I want to give a thank you and a shout out to Luther, who went on the ride with me, who's in attendance right now. And the call was, that Ferguson put out a national call. The family did, for a rally the week after the funeral. And so Black Lives Matter, it's 55 plus organizations that endorsed it, but I'm pretty sure hundreds of organizations who have been, working against police brutality, the school to prison pipeline, against the new Jim Crow, all these different organizations really, they were represented in the groups that went there. It was delegations from different cities and stuff, and for us it was from Portland, Olympia, Seattle, the Pacific Northwest. And the call was for people who had specific skill sets to be going and to be providing services to people who are, in Ferguson, in Canefield, as well as to be figuring out what we can be doing to sustain that and how we can be bringing it back into our own cities and to our own organizing. And there's a ton of different skill sets that went. There's people who, were medical, people who were mental health professionals, people who went, who understood marketing and understood, organizing, training, and just all these different things. And it was beautiful because we all showed up at this church. And for us from Portland, it was 46 hours driving straight. In a big red van and a tiny blue car. And that was intense. The trip alone was eye-opening. And we get there, there's 400 black people and one or two white, people who were, I think most of them were from parishes and stuff like that, and then me as a native. So that was a very interesting experience, and I'll go into a little bit more about red power and black power and the history of that. But we get there, and there's a lot of the young people who had been out every single night met us at the church. And there's Tef and Tori, who've been very active and just trying to keep people safe and stuff every night, who spoke and told about what they were doing every night, of trying to, bring education out to the people, trying to get eyewitness accounts and bring it to the police, and trying really hard to be working with that. And of course my favorite bit was at the end. There was this amazing woman who came on, and she'd been out every night, and she was speaking about what she was seeing in this rebellion and how it was, this was, for her, she saw this as a beginning of a revolution, that things are changing, that we cannot go back to the way it was, that with this sustained amount of activity, that it wasn't a moment, that it was a movement, and that it was going to stay that way and people were going to keep it that way, that she saw that this was things that moving things forward. And after that, we all went down to Ferguson and went down to Canefield. And we went up, and there's a couple thousand people, and we were walking past all the stores that no longer had glass in the windows. We're all boarded up, and there's the most beautiful graffiti that I had ever seen. And there was one that was a chalkboard that someone painted up, and someone had written, "What do I want to see before I die?" And just all these different things. But some of them were just I want to see my life. I don't want to see prison. I don't want to see I don't want to see police every day. I don't want to see the pavement and being shoved onto the pavement. And so walking past that and walking up to the intersection to turn into the street where Mike Brown was murdered, there were so many people. It was only like 2 blocks or so, but it felt like ages walking down those streets with everyone so close together, and everyone circles up, and there in the middle is where he was shot. And earlier that day or the evening before, the police officers had run over it and kicked it over. And I heard that someone had taken, had peed on it, is what I had heard. And everyone was circling up. And one of the things that people kept asking, in that I really thought was powerful, was, why are we re-traumatizing ourselves? We'd already seen it individually. Why are we re-traumatizing ourselves? And I think that's really important for a movement. I think that coming out of that's one of the biggest things that I learned, and I think that a lot of people learned, was that we had to have that re-traumatization together. We had to be broken together so that we could be healing together. And we can be like a broken bone. When it's healed, it's stronger. And so by breaking together and healing together, we're becoming stronger, and our movement is becoming stronger. And it reminded me so much of what Emmett Till's mother did. She kept the coffin open so that the world could see, and the world could see her grief, and the world could grieve with her, as well as see the despicable things that happened to her son. And I think that coming together in such a public way and seeing that, all the flowers had been trashed and knocked over, and they weren't set back up right away. They let us see that. And so then after that, people wanted to go up to the police station, and some people and the leaders, I don't know who they were and what they were representing, but they took us to a park instead. And so many people were so upset and hurt and in pain and crying because they were like, why aren't we going to the police station? Why are you secluding us into this tiny little park that's far away, that media can't get to, that is really, really kind of scary because it is just cloistered off? And people were just so, people had been going through trauma here, and they just... They needed to not be there, so a lot of people left, and then in the end, they marched, and a lot of stuff that was happening in the park at the stage was just very kind of shifting the blame and saying, we got to be working with the police, we got to be doing better ourselves, we can't expect the police to do better if we can't do better. And some of the things that I also heard that was, someone in the crowd had said, he was on the pathway, and it's better for the community. And just hearing that coming from, this was not somebody who had come from out of town, this is somebody who was from St. Louis. And just seeing the internalized racism that still happens within not just the Black community, but my community as well, the Native community. We also have that of the crazy Indian and stuff, but it's just... it's really hard to understand and to really understand and to feel for that, to understand that they're coming from this place that they just need to find something to figure out what's going on. I'm running out of time, but I guess I'm going to go really quickly. I'm going to skip ahead. At the police station, there was a line of police, and there was a bunch of kids who were babies, and they were asking the police, when am I going to die? One of them was like, when should I plan to die? I got a life. I got to figure out what I'm going to do in between here and now. Another thing is that night, a lot of us wanted to go back out and to sit out with people there was Tent City, so an encampment since day one, who'd been out there, people who were friends with with Mike Brown to go sit out there with them. And some of the things that we were told that, at the McDonald's that was there, that, nobody was bringing in guns. That the McDonald's, there was a closed gate, and they would corral people into there, and there would be smoke, and they would shoot them. The police would shoot them, that they weren't arresting, that there was no constitutional rights anymore. People were just being slammed on the ground and taken. There were people that they had not heard from day one. They had no clue where they were. They just disappeared. And another thing is, as days went on, the police were losing control of the neighborhood. When I left, we were told that the police had lost complete control of the neighborhood, and they had wounded egos, and so they're trying to make it work, and not make it work. They're trying to assert that terrorized the neighborhood into going back into the status quo. And another thing that TEF told me, that the gangs had declared war on the police and said that we're not going to let you come into our neighborhoods anymore, that you got to stay out of our neighborhoods. We're not allowing you to be doing violence. And it regardless of gang lines, they were working together. And I mean, I don't know that neighborhood, so I can't, and this is coming from one person, so I can't, I'm just trying to get out all the things that I heard from different people. Another thing was just another tactic that they were doing. They started walking in circles because you couldn't stop moving during the night. You couldn't stop moving at all. You had to work in circles. And the only people who weren't walking in circles was the RCP, who were going up and they were fighting with the police and instigating violence. And they were getting violence on them, but mostly it was targeted back onto the black people who were not doing that. And so, I mean, that's one thing that I was like, you got to make sure when you're going into a community that you're working with them and you're not doing stuff that's going to harm the community. And I think that's a very important revolutionary lesson, and I'm very proud to say that when I had comrades who went down there and they met me, that they went in there as solidarity, and they asked, what can we be doing to help you? And they brought donations, and I think that's really important. About the looting, somebody said that they took a vote. They're trying to. At the same time, there was a small occupation at the police station. Who had Tef and Tori had brought a stack of all the all the first-hand accounts of what happened, and they occupied. But there was nobody there. There's no media. Nothing was happening, and they were sure that they were going to get kicked out and it was going to be forgotten. And so, a lot of youth got together and they're like, strategically, what can we do? What can we do to make this remembered? And they did what they decided to loot, and I commend them on that. I think that was a very strategic and important decision to be made. And then also just the amount of times that people were so welcoming to me. This was meant to be a block space, but I got invited in, and I was continuously invited and welcomed in. And I think that's something that's really important, is because Red Power and Black Power throughout United States history has been so incredibly together that you have to be staying together. We're tied together. We won't be able to liberate each other. We'll liberate ourselves without each other. And then the last thing I have is I brought up that re-traumatizing ourselves, and I think that's really important. I think that we can't be expecting ourselves either as revolutionaries or as anybody who is feeling oppression, but especially police brutality, to allow ourselves to not have that communal grief. The most important thing that I had was I sat with a bunch of young people who had been out, and we were going over and talking and crying, and at one point one of them just is dissolving and not able to sit up, and they say to the group, they said, am I going to die for this? I'm going to die for this. And having that collective grief also has solidified that we're ready to die for this. And I think that that's something that we need to allow ourselves to do as people who are part of a struggle, is to recognize that we're not individuals. We're together in this. And that means in all ways. Thank you.
I think I've been a professor and a writer too long, so unlike Carol, I actually have printed pieces of paper that I'm going to be reading from. Thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing this. This is the kind of event that we need more of. I'm going to read. As some of you have heard 1 month ago, and I know that some of us actually were at that nasty incident. As some of you have heard, 1 month ago, many of us held a vigil at Westlake Plaza in solidarity with Gaza. And as usually happens at these rallies, an onlooker started harassing us. The harassment became quite aggressive and confrontational, so a few newcomers to the rally called them all security cops. Now, you know, some of us would know better than to call the cops, but some people called the cops. They pointed to the man who was harassing us, who was a white man in his 40s with his shirt off, and the cops maced Raymond Wilford, a completely innocent bystander who did not look anything at all like the agitator who was verbally attacking us. Here's the deal. The agitator was white. We told security about him, specified a shirtless white man. If I had PowerPoint, I would have shown you the difference. The cops spotted Raymond Wilford, a young black man. They assumed criminality and they maced Wilford. When the cop maced Wilford, just about everyone at the rally screamed, "You maced the wrong man, you've got the wrong man, let go of him, we've got the wrong man." And I know that, you know, some people in the room were there defending that, but the cop only got much more aggressive, more violent, more confrontational. He dragged Wilford away, and the agitator, the shirtless white man, walked away with a disgusting smirk on his face. Again, if you look at the pictures, it's like it was such a painful incident. So this incident, I'm bringing it up because it illustrates perfectly the state of racism and law enforcement violence that brown and black people live under. Just as importantly, it illustrates a truth we know all too well and must never forget. We cannot depend on cops to be our friends, our allies, our protectors. It is not their understanding, it is not their mode of operation that they are here to serve and protect us. They serve and protect corporations and the people associated with the elite. Thank you. So even in a situation where we tell a mall security cop that we are harassed by a white man, it's the black man who gets maced. So events like these are now making the news, but what we need to know is that this is the history of racist police brutality goes back in the US to the very origin of the creation of police forces in the US. One of the lesser known facts about the police force in the US is that some of the first police patrols were formed specifically to capture runaway slaves. They served white slave owners who wanted to continue the enslavement of black people. Slavery was and is a crime against humanity, but the police were there to serve and defend the criminals, not the victims of the crime, not the runaway slaves. That is the history of the police in the US. They were basically serving the criminals by capturing runaway slaves. And intergenerational memory and institutional memory and the very foundation of an institution is a force to be reckoned with. As James Baldwin said, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. US cops do too. They carry within them the racist history of the function they were formed to fulfill, to capture the victims of the most repressive systems that a society can think of. That is the formation of the police force in the US. So let's move now, since we're here to make the connections, let's move to 2 continents away where we have a similar situation, namely one where we have a settler colonial nation, just like the US, founded on genocide and the dispossession of the native people. And for reasons that are beyond the scope of this talk, we're going to talk, I can't, for reasons beyond the scope of this talk, we're not going to discuss why Israel does not have slaves. That's a question of labor, which I'm happy to talk about at some other point. Nevertheless, to make the comparison, the police force and the military in Israel were from day one designed with one objective: to subdue anyone who was not a member of the elite or the chosen people. That is the function of the Israeli army and the Israeli police, to control the people who are not the chosen people. And so we have the Israeli military from day one, which was a terrorist force that was formed to kill, dispossess, displace, get rid of an unwanted population, the Palestinian people. So just as the history, the formation of the police force in the US was to control the unwanted in some ways. I mean, of course they wanted the slaves, but they were the non-chosen, the non-elite. And we have a very similar formation for the military and the police in Israel: basically control, suppress, and defend, protect the criminals. So today the connections between Israel and the US give the expression, it's a small word, a whole new dimension. There are so many connections between the military and law enforcement violence, cooperation between the 2 countries. I think most of us are aware of the fact that the Israelis train the police forces in most US cities, in most US airports. I've talked to the Seattle Police Department here, and they don't even know that their training videos are actually made in Israel. So they watch videos, they have to go to workshops and watch videos, and they're experts speaking and all of that. And the police themselves are not aware that those videos and those workshops are actually made in Israel. And those workshops and experts who put the videos, so the police department has to watch a video on riot control and crowd control and racial profiling and all of that, those are made by Israelis. And so sometimes the police themselves are not even aware of who is training them. But the videos and the experts that are brought to do these are Israeli. So we have the US police force, the TSA, all of these are actually trained by a police force, a military, that is absolutely aggressive and open in its discrimination. Israel does not mince words, does not claim that we're not controlling the Palestinians. That's what the military does. It protects the settlers from the Palestinians in occupied land. There's no let's be nice about it in Israel. And this is the training that the US police is getting. So these are some of the connections. Oh, my mic is completely gone. Okay. All right. So when the police are trained by the Israeli military, by experts, and very frequently they're retired military generals, they're retired police people, but they become the experts, they become the trainers of the US police. When the US police is trained into that, what it is learning is more aggressive, more confrontational racism. So, okay, I'm going to jump. The connections between the oppressed populations are so clear to Palestinians, because we know who's training the U.S. forces, that Palestinians expressed their solidarity with African Americans during the Ferguson protests, and many individuals and organizations issued and signed statements denouncing the militarized U.S. police brutality and expressing support for the people who took to the streets in protest. A new hashtag appeared on Twitter, Palestine to Ferguson, or solidarity with Ferguson, or just Ferguson, but there was this hashtag that was trending on Twitter, and Palestinians, who are all too familiar with tanks in the streets and with tear gas and a whole lot more, actually offered advice to the protesters in Ferguson. So some of the tweets that were being issued from Israel, for example, from Palestine, Mariam Barouti, a student at Birzeit University, wrote, "Solidarity with Ferguson. Remember to not touch your face when tear gassed or put water on it. See, Palestinians having been tear gassed so many times, no, you don't touch your face, don't put water on it. Always make sure, another tweet, always make sure to run against the wind, to keep calm when you're tear gassed, the pain will pass, don't rub your eyes. Ferguson solidarity. Another one, again, from the Palestinians who know what tear gas is. Don't keep much distance from the police. If you're close to them, they can't tear gas. Which is true. I mean, like the cops like to throw it way out. They don't want you very close, because if they're throwing it, you know, it makes sense. They're not gonna tear gas themselves. Well, it takes someone who's been in that situation to give that kind of advice. And that was a tweet from Palestine to Ferguson. Don't keep much distance from the police. If you're close to them, they can't tear gas. Another one, it's always the oppressed caring for the oppressed. No matter where in the world, Palestine stands with Ferguson. You know, there's a lot. Yeah, I'm trying to all right. And another one that I really like, where I come from, what some call rioting, we call an uprising. And people in Missouri themselves were also making the connection. Some tweets coming out of Missouri read, cops warn the crowd, the photographer's gas mask comes out, someone is chanting Gaza Strip. So obviously the people in Ferguson were saying Gaza Strip. Another one said, we are being occupied. Will we as a people rise up like the people of Gaza? So the connections were being made by on both sides. And then Palestinians here issued statements in support. One of the statements that's too long for me to read, but signed by any number of Palestinian individuals and organizations, including US ACBI, my organization. We understand your moral outrage. We empathize with your hurt and anger. We understand the impulse to rebel against the infrastructure of a racist capitalist system that systematically pushes you to the margins of humanity. With a black power fist in the air, we salute the people of Ferguson and join in your demands for justice. That's one of the statements that was issued. So I want to, okay, I'm sort of like totally running out of time, but I want to say that, when we come together, that's where we have the most power, because even though it actually, at times of extreme stress, we tend to take the path of least resistance and focus on only our own challenges. We tend occasionally to engage in what I call oppression Olympics. Who's more oppressed? The blacks, the Native Americans, the Palestinians, and that's very, very disempowering. I mean, who wants to talk about oppression Olympics? Who wants to win that? You know, but in times of stress, we do tend to look inwards. These are very, very stressful times. We actually have to start looking outwards. We have to expand our circles of solidarity, our support system. We have to understand that we are in a joint struggle. We are in a joint struggle. It's not a big leap. You know, it's the reality, and that understanding is beneficial to that. Yeah, to all of us. So, and I also want to say, and I'm going to try and cut it down, just end here. I also want to speak very briefly, when I speak about support solidarity, I also, in my talks, try to very much speak about cultural appropriation. We tend to think that that's something whites do when they wear feathers in their hair and whatever, but there's also a lot of cultural appropriation that happens within circles of solidarity. So I think acting in solidarity is one thing. It's important, it's essential, it's vital, and it stems from an understanding of joint struggle. But we must avoid the special kind of cultural appropriation which occasionally happens in solidarity circles. We are not, and this is my pet peeve, we are not all Trayvon Martin. If I'm wearing a hoodie and walking in a fancy middle-class neighborhood at dusk, I will not appear threatening to the likes of George Zimmerman. And we are not all Palestinians. The fact that most of you in this room can actually travel to Palestine, and the fact that I cannot because I'm Palestinian, means we are not all Palestinians. So let's not equate. Let's not act as if it was identical. And the way we don't act as if our struggles were identical is by educating each other about each other's struggle. It is incumbent upon us to learn about each other, which is why I think an event like this, where everyone can speak from one perspective, and we're all learning, and we're all here to learn about that. That's important because you have to take your leadership from the people whose body is on the line in a specific moment. And so if I'm going to talk about racism, about anti-black racism in the US, I take my leadership from people who have experienced anti-black racism in the US. And I hope and expect and anticipate people in genuine solidarity to take their leadership from the Palestinians rather than say, this is what you should be doing. Okay? No cultural appropriation, expand our circle of solidarity, expand our support network. We are in this together, and let's harness our energy. In moments like the killing of one more black person, and moments like one more carnage in Gaza, many of us take to the streets, and many of us go back home after that and don't do much. If we don't do much following that moment of anger, of outrage, of absolute disgust with the system, if we don't harness that energy, the system continues. We are the ones who can stop the system, but it takes education, it takes action. Thank you.
I'm so grateful that this event is happening. And I think it's so important that it's happening. I've been doing some work, some media work with an organization that does peace and human rights and justice work in Palestine, Israel, and we were trying to get the press interested in covering a story about these connections that Nada just talked about between Ferguson and Palestine, about the tweets with tear gas tips that were coming from activists in Palestine to folks in Ferguson, about the people who were marching in Ferguson holding Palestinian flags, about the marches happening about Gaza here where chants were being heard from Ferguson to Palestine, occupation is a crime, and producer after producer and after producer said, no, that's not a story, that's not interesting, that's not something to, and so the fact that we're here exploring those connections and deepening those connections and revealing those connections is very, very important, because the mainstream media, well, we can't rely on them for much, and certainly not for that. My work really began, the work I was doing as a human rights activist really began in Palestine, and for a long time I was really focused on the U.S. role in human rights abuses that were happening overseas. So human rights abuses that we were giving political cover to, or that our taxpayer money was funding. I was really focused on that, and it really wasn't until, I'd say relatively recently, till about 2007, that I started actually even looking and becoming really aware of the human rights violations that were happening right here at home. Not just the ones that we were exporting, but the ones that we were committing right here at home. And that was when I became involved in Troy Davis's case. And like you heard in the introduction, Troy Davis was an innocent man on Georgia's death row who was ultimately executed despite a worldwide mobilization to try to prevent that execution. It's almost the 3-year anniversary of when Troy was murdered. And the deeper I got in, and it started out with just me writing Troy a letter after I saw his sister Martina speak on Democracy Now, and then that got me just farther and deeper engaged, and the more I got involved in Troy's case and with him and with his family, the more I began to learn first about the death penalty, and about the racism that undergirds the death penalty. And I began to then start to go deeper and deeper into that and realize, well, it's not just the death penalty. The death penalty is the sharp edge of what I would say was the broken criminal justice system. And I don't even like using that word, the broken criminal justice system, because the more I really started to dig into the criminal justice system, the more I realized, no, it's actually not broken. It's working exactly the way it was intended to work. And I began to see the criminal justice system as one element of state violence. and the state violence that's perpetrated in this country and not on all communities, but on certain communities, on communities of color, and to some extent communities of poverty. And the overlap, of course, of those two is a part of the state violence. The Venn diagram of that is a part of the state violence. And I began to see all these connections, and of course, as soon as I started looking at things with a lens of state violence, then that brought me right back to what I was seeing in Palestine, and that connection became clear. And you know, the connections just began for me to really grow from there. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that the country that incarcerates the largest number of people in the world, which is the US. We have more human beings that we have warehoused in prisons in the US, both in terms of straight up numbers and in terms of per capita, than any other country in the world. I don't think it's a coincidence that the country that does that also funds and supports the policy, the Israeli policy of incarcerating 1.8 million people in Gaza in the largest open air prison in the world. So this is not a coincidence. This is something that is a very deep and profound connection. And I think when you start looking at the deeper layers of that, in my mind, it comes down to the dehumanization that is so much at the core, I think, of all of this. If we did not, if the power structures and systems in this country did not so thoroughly see as less than human or other than human black and brown folks in this country, we would not be able to literally, sweep folks up and warehouse them, and of course, and kill them in the case of the death penalty, and straight up state-sanctioned murder them. And the same thing is true, of course, in Palestine. If Palestinians were not so thoroughly dehumanized, seen as less than human, other than human, we in this country cannot be comfortable with our tax dollars and our political cover supporting and funding the policies that murder entire families. 500 children just in the latest round, the latest assault in Gaza alone. And so part of, and I know today's discussion has to do with resistance and solidarity, and so part of what I try to think about when I think about resistance is what are the different ways that look like? Resisting, not just resisting the oppression, but also resisting that dehumanization. And how can I and how can we, because I'm not Palestinian and I'm not African American, I'm a white Jewish American, and how can I be in true solidarity and in true partnership with folks who are both resisting that oppression and resisting that dehumanization. And I just want to tell just a couple very short stories that I think are powerful examples that I've observed of that kind of resisting dehumanization, that when people and power structures are trying to strip people of their basic dignity and strip people of their humanity, and they are responding in ways that are insisting on embracing and expressing their humanity and their dignity. And of course, the hands up, don't shoot in Ferguson, I think, has become emblematic of that kind of resistance of dehumanization. But I want to tell really quickly a story that I saw on Georgia's death row, which was when I was there the night that the state of Georgia killed Troy. And the parole board denied him clemency. The execution had been dated 2 days before. It was September 21st. We were all standing in the prison yard holding vigil with Troy's family. There's a whole series of appeals that happened that night. And by the time the final appeal, which was, sort of the 11th hour last-ditch effort, by the time it went down from the Supreme Court, and some folks might have been watching this on Democracy Now!, it was around 10:30 p.m. We got the final appeal from the Supreme Court that there was going to be no stay. The execution was going to take place effective immediately. And later on, when you get the news reports, all of the exact times of things, like what time they took Troy from the death watch cell and brought him into the execution chamber, what was the exact moment they strapped him down, when he said his last words. You find that out later. Standing there in that moment, you don't know any of that. You just know that Troy is in some stage of the process of being murdered by the state of Georgia. And Troy's sister, who was very, very ill, she ended up passing away of cancer 2 months after Troy was killed. She busted out of the hospital when Troy's execution date was set so that she could be there with and for Troy during those final days. Martina, who I had seen that initial interview with, which was what led me to write to Troy. And I was standing next to Martina. She was in a wheelchair, too weak to stand, hardly strong enough to speak. And it was in that moment, that horrible moment of waiting. What's happening? And her brother she called him, they weren't twins, they were 17 months apart, but she called him their twins because she said they had twin souls. And at that moment, I was standing next to this woman, Laura, who was at that time the death penalty abolition campaign director for Amnesty USA. And Martina called Laura over. She said, "Laura, I need to tell you something." And Laura and I both looked at each other like whatever Martina needed to say at that moment, while her brother was being executed, had to be pretty important. So Laura went over, and Martina grabbed the arm of this young woman who she'd been talking to. She said, "Laura, I want you to meet Monica." Monica drove all the way here from California to be with us, to stand here in the prison yard with us tonight. She wants to get involved in the death penalty abolition movement. I want you to hook her up with, the folks in California, connect her to those people. And so Laura and this woman, Monica, are exchanging phone numbers, and at that moment, a photographer who was with us named Scott Langley snapped a photograph, and because of that photograph, we know the exact time that this exchange happened because of the timestamp of the photograph, and it was 11:08 p.m. on September 21st. Well, later, once you find out all the information, later we learned that 11:08 p.m. was the precise time of Troy's death. The precise time that Troy succumbed to lethal injection. And so what was Martina doing at the very moment that the state killed her brother? At that precise moment, Martina was enlisting another soldier in the struggle to bring down the system that killed her brother. And that is one of the most powerful forms of resistance, both to oppression and to dehumanization that I have ever experienced. And I want to really quickly tell another story, which I think connects to perhaps some of what Nada was saying, which I think is an attempt of folks to offer support. And it happened years ago, and I know it's my story. It's my friend Sami Al-Jundi's story, a Palestinian man who I partnered with to write his memoir, which is called The Hour of Sunlight. And he tells a story. At that time, he was working at an organization called the Palestinian Center for the Study of Nonviolence, and as happened quite often, there's a village called Turmus Aya in the West Bank, and the nearby settlement called Shiloh had come and raised all the village's olive trees, hundreds and hundreds of olive trees. And a group of Israelis from Peace Now called Sami at the center and said, we would like to raise money to be able to offer to this village so they can buy new olive trees and replant them. And Sami made contacts with the village, and they invited Sami to come with some of the Israeli activists from Peace Now. And so they came, and they had an envelope of money, and the man who hosted them and they had lunch together said, only one man can accept this gift. His name is Abu Qasab. He's the oldest man in the village. He's sitting with the remains of the trees, and they led the Israeli activists to Abu Qasab, who started narrating the stories of every tree that was surrounding him and what family member it had been planted in honor of. This tree planted for his grandfather when his grandfather was born. This tree for his father. This was the tree he planted with his own hands when his son was born. Now all massacred. Sami said looking at the ravages of that felt like looking at Deir Yassin, which was one of the historic massacres in pre-state Israel, where over 100 Palestinians were killed. And they heard the story, and one of the Israeli activists tried to give the envelope to Abu Qasab and said, we've raised this money so that because we want you to know that not all Israelis agree with what the soldiers do and what the settlers do, and we want you to have the chance to replant the trees. And Abu Qasab first said to him, have you been treated well here? Have you had lunch? Were you given coffee? And they said, yes, thank you, sir. We've been treated very warmly and very kindly. And Abu Qasab said, good, I'm glad. And then he handed back the package of money. And he said, thank you very much, but I cannot accept this. And the Israeli activist said, why? You can, with this money, you can plant new trees. And Abu Qassab said, we can raise our own money to buy new trees. Our problem is not money. And I wasn't there to ask Abu Qassab what he meant by that, but I think what he meant, and I think what Sammy meant when he relayed the story to me, that our problem is not money, is unless you're willing to come and join in a partnership that's going to challenge the infrastructure of oppression, challenge the systems of power and privilege that destroy one person, one community's olive trees and allows another community to mobilize a couple $100 and travel there easily and drop that off. The power imbalance in that dynamic, unless that is to be challenged at its core, it's not going to be a true partnership. And I think that's some of the questions that we need to be talking about deeply, and they're difficult and they're painful. But I think that's going to be the way we can build, I hope, true partnership and true solidarity. Thanks.
I want to start by talking about my day today at Garfield High School, because it was a great day. It was our first Black Student Union meeting, and I'm so happy that we have some students here from the Black Student Union at Garfield. And it felt just like a breath of fresh air. The school year started and we're all back together again. And there was just an outpouring of emotion around Mike Brown today at our meeting. The first order of business was to discuss the throwback dance that we want to organize. And then the money of that is going to go to the family of Mike Brown. So we're going to organize that event, and we'll let folks know about it. And then the second order of business at the Black Student Union meeting was, what do you think about Mike Brown? What do we do about it? It was an incredible discussion. It really gave me an insight about where people's thoughts are right now and what we need to do to organize resistance. The first student who spoke today said that what the situation made him realize is he needs to know how to handle police. And so he went online and researched his rights and went through and had this video link he wants to send out about what to do if you're stopped by the police, what your rights are, what you should say, and all of that. And I sat and listened, and some ideas occurred to me to say to him. And the most beautiful thing happened. Everything I was thinking I didn't need to say. The next student said, I appreciate that you said that we should research our rights and know what to say when we're stopped by the police, and know that you can say, I plead the fifth and I want an attorney. But the police don't care about us. And they don't care if we know our rights. In fact, if you know your rights, you antagonize them, right? Because now you're uppity, right? And one student after another today in our meeting talked about what it's like to know that the color of your skin makes you suspicious and makes you potentially the next Mike Brown. It's incredible to be around a bunch of young people who know that they could be the next Mike Brown, but also that they're unwilling to have that future laid out for them, and that they have another idea of where we need to go in this country and are ready to organize. And that's where I take my inspiration from tonight. Because I think, Mike Brown's case should be a wake-up call for us that people have been talking about the school-to-prison pipeline for a long time, a system of interlocking pieces such as zero tolerance discipline in the schools that push kids out in suspensions, high stakes testing that reduces kids to a number and often is tied to graduation, which is denying our kids graduation, leaving them without jobs. We know more and more police inside the schools are part of that system. When I taught 5th grade in Washington, D.C., the police would just roam the hallways, jacking up 4th graders, up against the wall, telling them, you're going to end up like your daddy, right? We've seen this school-to-prison pipeline. I think we need to start talking about the school-to-grave pipeline now that we're seeing in a summer increasingly of young black people's lives completely disregarded by this system that was so eloquently described before me. And I think this is the reality for black people in the United States today, the world's greatest democracy, right? And it shares a lot in common with the other great democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East that we're told, right, of Israel. They both, as Jen pointed out, rely on mass incarceration. So you have the entire population of Gaza basically incarcerated so that when they're not facing bombardment, military bombardment, right, they're just in a state of siege where it's a human rights catastrophe without medical supplies and basic necessities able to enter. In this country, as Michelle Alexander has pointed out in her book, The New Jim Crow, there are more black men, more black people behind bars today in the United States than were slaves on plantations in 1850. Right? This is your world's greatest democracy. We have a system that completely disregards black life in the world's greatest democracy, so that you have every 36 hours, or a more recent study, I think, even updated it to 28 hours, a black person is killed by the police in the United States, right? And these are paid vacations for the police until they come back, right? So there's actually an incentive if you're stressed out at work and you need some time at home with your family, an easy thing to do is shoot a black person, all right? In Israel, they laid waste to Gaza, as Jem pointed out, 500 kids killed, 3,000 injured. I think what's often not talked about is the entire population of Gaza suffers trauma, right? Suffers from PTSD, because everybody knows somebody or has been directly affected by that war. And I think that the attack, the basic police terror in this country plays a similar role, right? We know the names of the people who we have footage of who have been killed by the police, but there is a collective trauma in black communities around this, where most people in a black community know someone who's incarcerated or has been brutalized or murdered by the police. In the world's greatest democracies like to share a lot, and so Israel, it was discovered that the tear gas canisters being shot in Ferguson were supplied by the same company that produces the tear gas that they shoot at the people of Palestine. The world's greatest democracies, Israel and Palestine, they have efficient media systems that continue to repeat the slogans that they're the world's greatest democracies. And then when things like the Ferguson uprising happen, we hear about the looters, right? If the people in Ferguson are looters, then what do we call the banks that sabotage the global economy and walked away with trillions of dollars of our money? What word? I think we have to invent a new word to describe that, right? We hear from the American media about black on black crime, right? to divert attention from the fact that yet another white police officer has gunned down a young black man. And we should be ashamed for raising our voices against that crime because black people are killing each other, goes the narrative in the media, right? Completely leaving aside the fact that most homicides are committed by people of the same race. We never hear anything about white-on-white crime, right? Because we live in a racist country. And we never hear about the conditions that create desperation, right? We never hear about the fact that when that $1 trillion went to bail out the banks, that it came out of our school budgets, right? That it came out of our low-income housing budgets, right? That it created the conditions that we live in that lead to violence. And then, of course, you have the media in the world's greatest democracies talking about the war on Gaza. So you had the Baltimore Sun have the headline, "Sharp Rise in Gaza Deaths. 13 Israeli soldiers, 70 others killed." Right? So the Israelis get to be human beings and labeled, and then the others are the Palestinians. And it's even worse in some of the Israeli newspapers. Amazing. And of course, these two great democracies share something very much in common, is that they were formed on the dispossession of the indigenous population, right? And so you have an indigenous people who are in the way and basically need to be exterminated to carry out your project of democracy. And when a group of people become peripheral and unimportant to the system, when they're irrelevant to the system, they face very, very dire fate. And I think that increasingly, like in St. Louis County, you have 47% of African Americans unemployed, right? They're increasingly irrelevant to the economy there. That's a dangerous position to be in, because if they don't need you to make money off of you in some factory or low-wage job, then why not lock you away or shoot you down in the street, right? And that's the problem that Palestinians face as well, right? Because they aren't a central part of the Israeli economy, there are politicians openly calling for genocide in the Israeli Knesset. So I just want to end by saying that I had a chance to travel to Israel and Palestine in a 2011 delegation with the Interfaith Peace Builders' first African Heritage delegation. It was an amazing experience, life-changing experience, because I learned so much, not only just about Palestine and their struggle, but about the African American struggle as well. I went with a delegation of over a dozen activists from ages 25 to 77. And many of the black people who were on this delegation were veterans of the civil rights movement in the South. One of the women, Gloria, was the first black teacher in Mississippi to integrate a school. And when she got to that school, she told this story to Palestinian activists in the West Bank. When she got to school the first day, it was surrounded by the Ku Klux Klan on horseback with shotguns, right? Saying, "You're not going to teach my kid," right? And what Gloria told the Palestinians was that at least they had to wear hoods. These settlers who are coming in, kicking you out of your homes, taking over your land, do it, unabashedly. And at one point in our trip, we got to go to Sderot, which borders Gaza in Israel. And we were taken to the top of a hill by an Israeli peace activist. And from the top of that hill, we could look over the apartheid separation wall and see into Gaza. And as we were watching this Israeli activist told us that oftentimes the Israelis in this town would come up to the top of this hill and set up lawn chairs to watch the bombing of Gaza, drinking and celebrating the war. And during the most recent bombardment, I read reports again that hill was again a site of revelry for Israelis celebrating the destruction of Palestine. When we got back to the bus, when we got down the hill, we got back to our bus, this Israeli peace activist said to us, I'm completely against the bombing of Gaza, and I think it's really wrong that people go up there and cheer it while it's happening. That's very sick. But also, the people of Gaza need to know that we're here and we're not going anywhere, and they need to learn to live with us. And one of the more elder members of our delegation said, you should have learned a long time ago that separate isn't equal, right? And they struck up singing We Shall Not Be Moved on the bus right after that, only they replaced the words to say like an olive tree standing by the water. And I think there's a proud history that African Americans have of supporting Palestine. It goes a long way back, including the Black Panther Party in the United States, where Huey, in one of his famous statements, said, "We support Palestine 100%. And I'm proud that the delegation we went on came to support the call for BDS. And I think that is something that we all need to familiarize ourselves and be part of. If you were down helping to try to block the Israeli ships coming in here, that's exactly what we need to begin to organize around. Our statement from the African Heritage Delegation said, because of our experience fighting racism and exploitation in the United States, we are united in our support for civil and human rights of all peoples of the world. The Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the blockade of the Gaza Strip are in direct violation of international laws and several United Nations resolutions. The occupation has led to the physical and psychological harm of a whole people. And the power that they have is in their media, in their untold vast amounts of wealth. And the power that we have is a new generation of people that refuse to be silent, that will take to the streets like we saw in Ferguson and like we're going to see at Garfield High School and around the country, and building solidarity. Thank you.
I would actually be disinclined to agree with you that the white working class is not irredeemably racist here. I think that there are as many irredeemably racist white people in any class in the US, not necessarily in the working class, at all levels of the American white population. There are some irredeemably racist people and some who are actually okay. So that assumption I disagree with. Yes, the Israeli population has been shifting to the far right at a staggeringly and frightfully fast rate and speed. Nevertheless, there also is within Israel a core, a very small number, but of truly, genuinely anti-Zionist Israelis, not anti-Zionist Jews as we have, here, for example, but anti-Zionist Israelis who actually do a lot of the work for us. I'm an organizer for BDS, and a lot of the information that we get is information gathered for us by Israelis because they have more access to the information. For example, we have Who Profits, and Who Profits does all the research within Who Profits, so that when we ask for a boycott of a certain product, our research is very, very solid, and Who Profits is an Israeli organization of Israelis who are pro-BDS. There's also within Israel a group called Boycott from Within, and those are, again, Israelis, the Boycott from Within, who are totally pro-BDS. So it's very, very small, and yes, the Israeli left, the Zionist left, if you want, is like liberals in the US. They don't quite get it. Because they're still Zionist, but that doesn't mean that there aren't within Israel some really solid allies, just like there are in the US some genuinely anti-racist whites. And I don't necessarily see that those genuinely anti-racist whites belong to a certain class in the US. Others were going to answer that, and then...
Yeah, I think that there was a lot of talk when Obama got elected about the new colorblind era, right? And how many different events do we need to see that we do not live in a colorblind society, from the institutions to the money that you saw get raised for that white officer? We live in a deeply racist society, and we saw how the stranglehold that racism still has on so many white people in our society. I do think there's a difference, though, between the two societies that I want to throw out and see what people think. I think that in the U.S. society, there is obviously a completely different existence that white and black people live when you don't have to think about police terror on a daily basis. But I do think that white people in this country need to wake up, because they actually would benefit from getting rid of many of the racist institutions that exist in our society, right? A lot of working class white people actually would benefit if we shut down the jails and put that money towards their families and the schools of their own kids. Right? But because they hold racist ideas, they're not out there trying to get rid of that jail, because they think it's keeping their kids safe from the black kid in the neighborhood or whatever. But actually, materially, their lives would be better if they were able to help get these funds away from mass incarceration, from destruction of Gaza, right? From all the ways that the U.S. Government is using it to actually go into the health care, the education, the well-being of their families as well, is held back by a racist system. Whereas I think in Israel, I think one of the reasons why you're seeing the Israeli working class or Israeli population in general just moving further and further to the right is actually they benefit quite handsomely, materially, from racism in their society. In fact, the reason that their state exists is because the United States sees it as a useful launching pad in the most oil-rich region in the world. They need some kind of ally that's compliant, that they can work with, and they only are useful as long as they can play that role of repressing Palestinians. They'll get the cash flowing in from the United States, right? And until I think that makes a fundamentally different situation where they materially benefit and are better off because of a lot of the racism, which makes it more difficult for Israelis to become anti-Zionist. And I met some incredible anti-Zionist Israelis there too that I want to give a shout out to and say how incredible and important they are to the movement. But it is so minuscule when you think about it. It's just such a small number that actually want to see full human rights for Palestinians.
Just want to add one thing. Most of what I wanted to say was already said, but in the pre-State of Israel days, there was actually, through the Communist Party and other labor organizations, there was actually a lot of Arabs and Jews. They weren't Israelis yet. It was pre-state. And in the very beginning years of the state, within the citizens of Israel, Palestinian and Jewish, and there was a lot of recognition of that interests were the same among working people, and there were joint labor unions and joint organizing, and that got squelched pretty early on because, of course, for the same reasons why there's a lot of divide strategies here, and that working folks here, regardless of race, and if they were to get together and see that the interests were in common, and that the oppressor are the corporations and the folks protecting those corporations, and who are afraid of the joint power that would happen if folks got together. And not just now, that you can look at the history in this country of times where folks realized that their interests were together, and and what happened, poor white folks got made the overseers of the slaves in order to introduce some kind of we'll give you some kind of privilege so that you'll get the benefit of feeling superior in order to keep people separate so that forces wouldn't join. And so I think that's in different ways that has played out both in Palestine, Israel, and here, to prevent folks who actually do have common interests. Because Israelis and Palestinians who want to raise their children in a situation of safety, security, and dignity, they do have common interests that are really, really freaking strong, right? And but it's being obfuscated intentionally so that they won't get together and fight for that jointly.
I guess I also want to say, even if we do come together, in the here and now, in midterm, long-term, revolution, and have a revolutionary vanguard, and have a working class who are joining together, masses that are coming together. That doesn't mean we will come together. That doesn't mean that we're going to get rid of racism by doing that. By coming into the revolution, that doesn't mean that we're getting rid of racism. We're going to have to be going and working much farther past that to be working through all the things that we've been socialized and normalized into our everyday lives. And I think that's really important to, as well as just it's not, but even just right now, we're not coming together is not going to solve it. We have to be constantly working every day, even past all the victories that we're going to be winning after we've come together. So yeah.
Thank you for having this event. I think it has brought up a lot of issues that needed to be articulated, aired, expressed, and I think it has left a lot that still needs to be talked about. We've opened a can of worms, a can of healthy worms maybe, or a healthy can of worms, whatever, but we have opened a can of worms, and clearly this is barely scratching the surface. This is barely we've named the issues, we haven't really addressed them because we were crunched on time. So I urge everyone who actually wants to be part of the solution to meet again, talk again, give us more times. Don't have speakers, just like a follow-up conversation would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I actually have anything to add. I love when this happens. Anytime someone was saying something, and in my head I was thinking about how I would want to respond, and then someone else responded, and I was like, oh, well, I don't need to say it. And I'm really glad, Jam, that you raised the issue of patriarchy. I feel like I don't know that I could, in a wrap-up thing, be able to address that and open that, but I think it's really important that is raised in this space, and that's a part of the conversation when we're talking about different layers and different forms of oppression. We hadn't talked about that really in this space, and so I'm glad that at least it was raised. And yeah, I feel like I've spent a lot of the last 6 years of my life and my work trying to find the points of connection between what from the outside looks like these very different issues that I work on. And for me, it's always been so obvious how interconnected it is. And the last 6 months, I have felt an excitement that I feel like people are waking up to that, about those interconnections in a much deeper and a much more substantive way than I ever felt before. So I do feel like we're at a moment now, and I hope that we will harness that moment and that we'll organize and that we'll mobilize.
So on the patriarchy, as a Native woman, I have to deal with, being part of a community that 1 in 3 women are raped or sexually assaulted in their lifetime. I'm part of that statistic. I have to live with that. Going on to Pine Ridge on the ride back with Black Lives Matter, it was really important that it was brought up and that we were able to understand that I would possibly be the target when we went onto that reservation, and being able to have that intersectionality of understanding different spaces that you're going into and different people and how they're feeling that oppression, even internally, and the internal racism and collective historical trauma that's passed down. And so also as a Native person, I want to just be like, God damn occupation. We're on Suquamish and Duwamish land right now that's stolen. We absolutely should always be recognizing, resistance is justified when the people are occupied. And I think that there's various forms of resistance. And personally, I'm up for whatever resistance is necessary. I'm going to take a part of, and I will dedicate my life to that, whatever comes up. But my last, statement would be dividing us is what the oppressors did. It's beneficial and profitable that we do not make these connections. So I'm so excited that we're here making them. Sadly, unfairly, even by reaching out as individuals, it's a revolutionary act. Just being here or saying, from a Native woman to a Black man, hey man, solidarity, I feel you. That's revolutionary, and that's unfair. That's so unfair that has to be a revolutionary act, and that's why this system, it even to that core, that even emotionally, that we have to be like, wow, that's something that the status quo does not want us to be recognizing. That's why the system must end, and I have to say the chant that was on the ground that was the most important was the shut it down. So I'm sure some of you guys know how it goes, but racist cops, shut it down. Killer cops, shut it down. The whole damn system, shut it down. Shut it down. Shut it down. And that was repeated, and that was powerful, and that's what the people of Ferguson were saying. So, yeah.
Right on. Yeah, shut it down. I'll just hit a couple quick questions that came up. On the media, I think the alternative media has been so critical to exposing these racist cops, and I think that the calls to go out whenever you see a cop stopping someone, arresting them, you should stop too and photograph it and get it on film and be there to document it. But documenting it alone, right, exposing it alone isn't going to stop it from happening. In fact, there's part of the system that actually likes to show itself off, to show, here's what we can do to you. And you can show it to other people and we'll still do it, right? And so it's powerful when we use it as an organizing tool to continue to fight back, and that's the key. Is we have to organize to fight back, and I think the way we organize should come from analysis of where the oppression comes from, right? Slavery, it was the function that created the wealth that led to the economic boom internationally that created capitalism, right? This system, and absolutely, and the theft of native land, right? And those things together are the birth of our economic system, right? The birth of the world's greatest democracy. And so if the oppression of Native and Black people is what this system was built on, then we're not going to end that oppression by this law or that law, right? By this change passed or that change passed. It's going to actually have to create a whole new economic system built on a whole different set of principles, right? And that's why I'm a socialist, because I think we need to overthrow capitalism. It's a system that's irredeemable. It comes dripping from head to toe in blood. And I think we need to replace it with a system built on solidarity. And I think that we've seen just the last thing about are we less racist. I think that my father could never have imagined having a Black president in the United States, right? White people did vote for a Black president. That being said, so I think that there is that shift in consciousness at one level, but I think what you said, Ayanda, is important, that there's different kinds of racism, right? And that there's so much covert racism that people don't want to acknowledge, and that the only way we're going to be able to overturn this system of capitalism that is about the mass exploitation of the 99% is if we take fighting racism as one of the most important aspects of that struggle. Because if we don't break down the main divide and conquer tool that they have, that the 1% has, there's no way we're powerful enough to overturn that system, right? And so, Frederick Douglass's famous quote, "They divided both to conquer each," I think should be the slogan that guides our movement as we fight against the system. Thank you.